David stood on the balcony of their shared apartment, watching the sprawling city of Lagos wake up beneath the soft glow of dawn. The air was already thick with the familiar scent of diesel and the humidity that hinted at another scorching day. Lagos, with its vibrant chaos, was the only place he'd ever known as home, and in this moment, as the sounds of the city began to stir, David couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of contentment. It was the kind of peace he had rarely known in his 28 years. He leaned against the railing, sipping from a chipped mug, and thought about Tina, the woman who had brought this newfound calm into his life. They had met by chance at a small cafe not far from Victoria Island, where David was working on a construction project. Tina had been sitting at a corner table, her face buried in a book, seemingly oblivious to the world around her. David, tired from a long day of hauling cement and dealing with demanding supervisors, had been drawn to her serenity. She seemed out of place in the noisy cafe, like a picture in the wrong frame. It was her smile, warm and inviting, that had broken the ice between them. A few casual exchanges later, they had started meeting regularly, and what began as light-hearted conversation quickly grew into something deeper. Tina had a quiet confidence that David admired. She wasn't the kind of woman who sought attention, yet she always seemed to capture it effortlessly. Her beauty was understated but undeniable, with her slender figure, striking brown eyes, and a natural grace that contrasted with David's rough-hewn appearance. She moved through life with a gentle assurance, which soothed the jagged edges of his own existence. He often marveled at how different they were, Tina, with her educated background and steady job in it, and him, a man whose hands bore the scars of hard labor. Despite their differences, David found himself drawn to her in ways he hadn't experienced before. There was a depth to Tina that intrigued him, a quiet mystery that made him want to know more. She spoke sparingly about her past, which he found puzzling, but he didn't push her. In the beginning, he was just grateful that someone as bright as her would even notice a man like him. Over time, they had built a life together, moving into a modest apartment in Yaba, a quieter district on the mainland. Their home was small but comfortable, filled with the unspoken compromises of a couple learning to navigate life together. Tina loved plants, and the apartment was dotted with greenery-potted ferns, succulents, and a small indoor palm that she had named Io. She said they reminded her of hope and growth, things she believed in fiercely. David, on the other hand, had insisted on the large, outdated television that dominated the living room. It was his way of holding on to the parts of his life that still felt familiar, a small sanctuary from the complexities of their relationship. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. They laughed together, shared quiet moments, and made plans for the future. On weekends, they would stroll through the local markets, Tina's hand slipping easily into his as they wandered past rows of vendors selling everything from fresh produce to handmade crafts. It was during these moments that David allowed himself to imagine what their life might look like in a few years. Perhaps they would move into a bigger place, somewhere with more space and fewer reminders of the past. Perhaps they would start a family. He had always wanted children, a legacy to leave behind, someone to carry his name forward. Tina never seemed as eager about the subject of children, but David assumed it was just her pragmatic nature. She was always more careful, more deliberate in her decisions, while he was content to dream. Yet beneath the surface of this idyllic relationship, there were small cracks, hairline fractures that David couldn't quite place. It wasn't that Tina was distant. In fact, she was always affectionate, always attentive to his needs. But there were times when she seemed to drift into her own world, moments when her gaze would cloud over as if she were retreating into a place David couldn't follow. She never spoke much about her family, which he found odd. Whenever he asked about her parents or childhood, she would respond with vague answers, quickly changing the subject to something else. It struck David as strange, but he brushed it off. After all, everyone had their secrets. In the evenings, they would often sit together on the sofa, watching whatever series was popular at the time. Tina would curl up beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, and for a while, all would feel right in the world. But even in these moments of closeness, David sensed that something was held back. It was as though there was a part of Tina he couldn't reach, a locked room in her heart to which he didn't have the key. He tried not to dwell on it. Tina had brought him more happiness than he had ever known, and he wasn't about to let idle suspicions ruin what they had. Still, the questions lingered at the back of his mind. Why was she so secretive about her past? Why did she never speak of old friends or mention any childhood stories? Even her social media presence was carefully curated, devoid of the usual flood of pictures and updates that most people their age shared. Whenever they went out, it was always to places where Tina seemed to be a stranger. She never ran into anyone she knew, never had awkward conversations with people from her past. It was as if she had arrived fully formed the day he met her. For a while, David let these thoughts fester in the recesses of his mind, convincing himself that he was simply being paranoid. After all, wasn't every relationship built on a foundation of trust? He had no reason to doubt Tina's love for him. She had shown him nothing but kindness, patience, and understanding. They had even talked about the possibility of marriage, though the conversations were always tentative, tinged with uncertainty. David had never proposed outright, but he often fantasized about it. He pictured them standing in front of a small gathering of friends and family, exchanging vows beneath the Lagos sun, starting a new chapter together. In these daydreams, the future seemed so bright, so full of promise. Yet there were moments when the unease would creep back in like a shadow stretching across their otherwise perfect life. It wasn't just her reluctance to talk about the past. Sometimes it was the way she would flinch ever so slightly when he touched her in certain ways, or the way her body would tense during intimate moments. David had noticed these things but had never brought them up. He told himself it didn't matter, that everyone had their quirks, their sensitivities. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the months passed, David found himself growing more and more curious about the parts of Tina she kept hidden. He wanted to know everything about her, to understand her fully. But every time he inched closer to uncovering the truth, she would retreat, leaving him with more questions than answers. It was like chasing a ghost, an elusive part of her that seemed to dissolve the moment he reached out to touch it. Still, life went on, and for the most part, David was happy. He had a steady job, a woman who cared for him, and a future that, despite its uncertainties, seemed to be unfolding in his favor. Whatever doubts he had, he kept them to himself, choosing to focus on the things that made their relationship strong. After all, wasn't love about accepting the person for who they were, even the parts you didn't fully understand? As he stood on the balcony that morning, watching the city come alive, David told himself that everything would be fine. He had Tina, and she had him. Whatever secret she was hiding, they didn't matter. What mattered was that they were building a life together, one day at a time. He took a deep breath, letting the humid air fill his lungs, and turned to go back inside. The sun was rising higher now, casting long shadows across the floor of their small apartment. Tina was still asleep, her form a gentle curve beneath the blanket. For now, David decided he would let the questions rest. They had time. They had each other. And that, for the moment, was enough. David had always been a man of routine. His days were marked by the steady rhythm of work, home, and the quiet moments in between where he allowed himself to simply exist. Over the past year since Tina had entered his life, that rhythm had gained a new layer of depth, of meaning. She brought color to the otherwise gray tones of his everyday existence. Her presence had filled the small gaps in his life, the empty spaces he hadn't even realized were there. And yet, in those same spaces, a new uncertainty had begun to grow, a quiet, nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. At first, it was easy to dismiss his unease as mere paranoia. Relationships, especially ones as deep and meaningful as the one he shared with Tina, came with mysteries. She had always been a bit guarded about her past, but David had chalked that up to personal preference. Not everyone was as open about their history, and maybe Tina was just more private than most. He didn't mind it, not really. What mattered was their future together, not the things she chose to leave behind. But then the small oddities started to stack up, and David couldn't ignore them anymore. Tina had grown more distant in recent weeks, not in a way that screamed of impending trouble, but in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. She seemed distracted, her attention drifting during their conversations, her responses a beat slower than usual. When they were together, there was a new tension in the air, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It was as if a shadow had crept into their lives, unseen but deeply felt. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, David came home to find Tina in the bedroom, hunched over her laptop. She barely acknowledged his arrival, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen, fingers tapping away at something she quickly minimized when she noticed him. It wasn't the first time she'd done this, but it was the first time David felt a sting of suspicion. What could she be hiding from him? He shrugged it off, telling himself it was probably just work-related. Tina had always been good at keeping her professional life separate from their personal one, and he respected that, but the seed of doubt had been planted. It was only a few days later, on a humid evening, that David's suspicions were reignited in a way he couldn't ignore. Tina had gone to the store, leaving her phone on the kitchen counter. It was something she often did. Tina wasn't as tethered to her devices as most people their age. Normally, David wouldn't have given it a second thought. But that night, as he glanced at the phone, something tugged at him, urging him to pick it up. He resisted at first. It felt wrong, an invasion of her privacy, but the persistent whisper of doubt gnawed at him until he gave in. He unlocked the phone and scrolled through her messages. Most were harmless chats with coworkers, some friends he vaguely recognized. But then his eye caught on a name he didn't recognize, Ifani. The conversation was brief, but something about it unsettled him. It wasn't flirtatious, but there was a familiarity there that didn't sit right with David. And then in one of the messages, the person addressed Tina as Tony. David's heart skipped a beat. Tony? He read the message again, certain he must have misread it. But there it was, clear as day. Tony. The rest of the message didn't make sense to him. It was filled with casual references to things he knew nothing about, people, places, memories that clearly didn't include him. Who was this Ifani? And why did he call Tina Tony? Confusion quickly gave way to a simmering unease. He felt a rising panic in his chest, a gnawing feeling that something was very wrong. He tried to shake it off, telling himself that there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a joke, a nickname from a time in Tina's life that she'd never mentioned. But why had she never mentioned it? And why did this name Tony feel like the key to a puzzle he hadn't even realized he was trying to solve? He put the phone down, his hands trembling slightly, and paced the small living room. The apartment felt stifling now, the air too thick, the walls too close. David's mind raced, jumping from one possibility to the next, none of them satisfying his growing sense of dread. Who was Tony? Why had Tina never mentioned this person? The questions buzzed in his head like a swarm of angry insects, refusing to be silenced. Over the next few days, David found himself obsessing over the name. He tried to bring it up casually in conversation, asking Tina about her friends, her past, anything that might give him a clue. But Tina remained elusive, as she always had. If she noticed his growing curiosity, she didn't let on. She continued with her usual routine: work, home, their occasional weekend outings, while David quietly unraveled. Unable to shake his suspicions, David decided to dig deeper. He began searching through her belongings when she wasn't home, something he hated himself for doing but felt compelled to pursue. He rifled through drawers, looking for anything that might give him answers. Old papers, photo albums, anything that might shed light on Tina's life before they met. But her past, it seemed, was carefully curated, as though she had deliberately removed all traces of what came before. Frustrated, David turned to the one place he hadn't checked: her social media accounts. Tina wasn't very active online, but she had a few accounts that he knew of. Her Facebook page was sparse, with only a few recent posts and pictures of the two of them together. But as he scrolled further back, to the time before they met, he noticed something odd. There were large gaps in her timeline, entire months where there were no posts, no updates, nothing. It was as if parts of her life had been erased. David's heart raced as he clicked through the few remaining photos from her past. There were pictures of her with people he didn't recognize, smiling faces at parties, gatherings, events. But in all of these, Tina looked different, not just physically, but in her expression. She seemed tense, uncomfortable, as though she was out of place in her own skin. It was a far cry from the confident, self-assured woman he knew. And then, buried deep in the photo archives, he found something that stopped him cold. A picture from several years ago, a group shot taken at what appeared to be a family event. There, standing among a crowd of people, was someone who looked like Tina but not quite. The person in the photo had shorter hair, a more angular build, and was dressed in a suit. The face was unmistakably hers, but the name tagged in the photo wasn't Tina. It was Tony. Maya. David stared at the screen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Tony. It couldn't be. But there it was, undeniable and irrefutable. The person he had been living with for the past year, the woman he had fallen in love with, wasn't who she claimed to be. Tony. The name echoed in his head, over and over, as the truth slowly began to unravel in front of him. Tina had been born Tony. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. David felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat, his body trembling with shock and disbelief. How could this be? How had he not seen it? He thought back to all the little moments that suddenly made sense: the secrecy, the vague answers about her past, the tension in her body during their more intimate moments. It all fit now, like the final pieces of a puzzle falling into place. Tina was a transgender woman. David's mind raced as he tried to comprehend the enormity of this revelation. His emotions surged in conflicting directions: anger, confusion, betrayal, sadness. He felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him, leaving him suspended in a void of uncertainty. The woman he thought he knew, the person he had envisioned spending his life with, had been hiding a fundamental part of herself from him. But as the initial shock began to fade, David's thoughts turned darker. He couldn't help but feel a deep, simmering sense of betrayal. Why hadn't she told him? Why had she kept this from him for so long? Did she not trust him enough to share this part of her life? His mind, already reeling from the discovery, began to spiral into anger. He felt as though his love, his trust, had been built on a lie. And in his heart, a dangerous seed was planted, one that would soon take root and grow into something far more sinister. David sat there in the dim light of their apartment, staring at the photo of Tony on his screen, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. His life, which had felt so steady, so certain just days ago, was now unraveling before his eyes. And in the silence of that moment, he made a decision, one that would set into motion a chain of events that neither he nor Tina could ever come back from. For now, the discovery remained his alone. But soon, the weight of this secret would prove too much to bear. The apartment felt unnervingly still when David returned home that evening. Outside, the sounds of Lagos honking cars, the murmur of street vendors, the distant thrum of music bled into the walls, but inside everything seemed muted. David closed the door behind him with deliberate slowness, his movements heavy, as though weighed down by the revelation he had uncovered. His mind was a storm, his emotions simmering just beneath the surface, threatening to break loose at any moment. Tina was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. The smell of sautéed vegetables and spices filled the room, normally something that brought David comfort after a long day of work, but tonight it felt oppressive, cloying, suffocating. He stood in the doorway, watching her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the person he now knew her to be. Tony. The name echoed in his mind, tainting everything he had believed about their relationship. He felt a surge of conflicting emotions: anger, confusion, betrayal. Each wave crashed over him in rapid succession, leaving him struggling to catch his breath. As Tina moved about the kitchen, oblivious to the storm brewing behind her, David clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. He had played out this moment in his head 100 times over the past few days since discovering the truth, but now that it was here, he felt unmoored, unsure of how to proceed. The question hung in the air between them, unspoken but heavy, like a weight pressing down on his chest. For a long time, David simply stood there, paralyzed by the enormity of what he was about to confront. His gaze bore into Tina's back as she worked, the familiar sight of her small, graceful movements suddenly taking on a foreign quality. This woman, who had shared his bed, his life, his dreams for the future, had been keeping something so fundamental from him. It wasn't just a secret. To David, it felt like a betrayal of the highest order. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow and uneven. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, David spoke her name. His voice was quiet, but there was a tension to it, a sharpness that made Tina stop mid-motion. She turned to face him, a smile on her lips, but the moment their eyes met, her expression faltered. Something in his demeanor gave her pause. She placed the knife she was holding down on the counter, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and stepped toward him. The air between them felt thick, as if charged with an invisible current, buzzing with the unsaid words that were about to tear through the fragile peace they had maintained for so long. David felt his pulse quicken, his anger rising to the surface, no longer containable. Every second of silence stretched painfully, heightening the tension until it became unbearable. He could no longer hold back the torrent of emotions that had been building inside him since the moment he discovered her secret. David launched into his accusation with a coldness that surprised even himself. His words were laced with bitterness, each one a sharp weapon aimed at the person standing before him. He didn't need to raise his voice's tone. Low and simmering with barely restrained fury, was enough to convey the depths of his anger. As the words left his mouth, Tina's face shifted from confusion to a deep, unsettling realization. She understood even before he finished speaking. David saw the truth dawn in her eyes, the sudden clarity that he had uncovered the secret she had kept hidden for so long. In that moment, the distance between them became palpable, a chasm that had always been there but was now laid bare in the open. Tina's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the counter to steady herself. Her eyes, usually so full of warmth and quiet confidence, were wide with shock and a deep, sorrowful fear. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain, but David cut her off before she could say a word. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to listen to any more lies, any more excuses. Tina's body seemed to shrink under the weight of his words, her posture wilting as though the air had been knocked out of her. She didn't move to defend herself, didn't try to argue. Instead, she looked at him with a pained expression, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The silence between them grew heavier, more oppressive, as the enormity of the moment sank in. For a brief second, David saw a flash of vulnerability in her, a silent plea for understanding, for compassion. But his anger, his sense of betrayal, was too overwhelming. He didn't know what hurt more, the fact that she had kept something so vital from him, or the fact that, despite everything, he had loved her deeply. He had imagined a future with her, a life built on trust and mutual respect, but now that dream felt shattered, irreparably broken. His thoughts raced, each one tinged with bitterness and confusion. How could she have deceived him like this? How could she have let him fall in love with someone who wasn't who he thought she was? As Tina stood there, her shoulders hunched and her face pale, David's anger shifted into something darker, more dangerous. His mind raced with questions, each one feeding the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He tried to push down the rising tide of rage, but it was like trying to contain an ocean with his bare hands. He couldn't stop it, couldn't control the flood of feelings that threatened to consume him. In his heart, David felt torn between two conflicting forces. Part of him wanted to understand, to ask why she hadn't trusted him with the truth. He wanted to know if her love for him had been genuine, or if their entire relationship had been a lie. But the other part of him, the darker part, was consumed by a sense of betrayal so profound that it felt like a physical wound. He couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a fool of him, that she had stripped away his sense of control, his understanding of himself and his world. As the minutes dragged on, the tension between them continued to grow. David felt the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him, suffocating him. He paced the length of the living room, his mind racing, fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Tina watched him with a mixture of fear and sadness, her face drawn tight with anxiety. She looked like she wanted to reach out to him, to offer some kind of comfort or explanation, but she remained rooted in place, as if frozen by the enormity of what was unfolding. For a brief, fleeting moment, David considered walking away. He considered leaving the apartment and never looking back, letting the storm inside him subside on its own. But that moment passed as quickly as it had come, and in its place was a wave of uncontrollable fury. The betrayal he felt was too deep, too raw. Every time he looked at Tina, he saw the person he had loved and trusted, but now that image was tainted, distorted by the secret she had kept from him. As his anger boiled over, David felt his body move without thinking, driven purely by emotion. He knocked over the kitchen chair in a violent motion, the crash echoing through the apartment like a gunshot. Tina flinched, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't move. She stood there, frozen, as David's rage erupted around her. The words he hurled at her were venomous, cruel, each one designed to hurt, to cut as deeply as possible. He didn't care about the consequences anymore. All he wanted was to release the fury that had been building inside him since the moment he had discovered the truth. And through it all, Tina stood silent, her tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. The pain in her eyes was undeniable, but David couldn't bring himself to care. He was too far gone, too consumed by the sense of betrayal and the raw anger that had taken hold of him. He saw her pain, but in that moment he felt that it was nothing compared to what he was experiencing. The confrontation stretched on, each passing second thick with tension and unspoken emotions. David felt his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he struggled to contain the storm inside him. He didn't know how it would end, but he knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same between them again. Their relationship, once so full of promise and love, was now irreparably shattered. The secret that Tina had kept from him had ripped through the foundation of their bond, leaving nothing but jagged edges and broken pieces. And no matter what happened next, David knew there was no going back. The apartment was unbearably tense, the air thick with a silence that felt ready to shatter at any moment. David's mind was racing, consumed by anger, betrayal, and confusion. The confrontation with Tina had spiraled out of control, and now, all the emotions he had tried so hard to suppress were boiling to the surface. His body trembled with a rage that had grown too large to contain. Tina stood across from him, her tear-streaked face pale and drawn. The woman he had once loved, who had shared his dreams and his bed, now seemed like a stranger. The revelation of her secret, the truth she had kept hidden from him for so long, had shattered the foundation of their relationship. To David, it felt like everything he had believed about their life together was a lie, a fabrication built on deception. His heart pounded in his chest as he replayed the words she had spoken, the confessions she had made, and each one only fueled his growing sense of betrayal. His thoughts became darker, more chaotic, as the storm of emotions inside him swirled violently. He could hardly process the fact that Tina Tony had been living with him under a false identity, keeping something so fundamental from him. The questions burned in his mind, gnawing at him, filling him with an overwhelming urge to lash out. Why hadn't she told him? Why had she let him believe in a future that was built on lies? His fists clenched at his sides, the muscles in his arms tightening as he struggled to control the tidal wave of anger that threatened to drown him. He paced the floor, his eyes darting to Tina, who stood frozen, watching him with a mixture of fear and sadness. The air between them was charged with tension, an invisible barrier that neither could break. Tina's face, once so familiar and full of love, now seemed foreign, distant. David felt as though he didn't know her at all. Then, in a moment of blind fury, something inside him snapped. His hand shot out, knocking a glass off the table. It shattered against the floor with a deafening crash. Tina flinched, her whole body recoiling, but David barely registered it. His anger had taken over, clouding his thoughts, blurring the lines between reason and rage. He closed the distance between them in a few quick steps, his movements fueled by the burning need to release the pain that had been building inside him for days. Tina backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls of the small apartment closed in around them, trapping her. David's mind was lost in a whirlwind of emotions: betrayal, confusion, anger, all mixed together in a dangerous cocktail of resentment. He couldn't think clearly anymore. All he could feel was the raw, seething rage. Without thinking, David shoved Tina, his hands rough and forceful against her fragile frame. She stumbled backward, her body hitting the edge of the counter with a dull thud. The sound echoed in the apartment, but it didn't register with David. His mind was too clouded, too consumed by the need to make her feel the pain she had caused him. Tina's sobs filled the air, but they barely penetrated the fog of anger that had taken hold of him. She tried to speak, tried to reach out, but her words were lost in the storm. David's vision blurred, his heart pounding in his chest as he lashed out again, shoving her harder this time. She collapsed to the floor, her body crumpling beneath the force of his rage. The apartment, which had once been a sanctuary for their love, now felt like a prison. The noise of their struggle echoed off the walls, fists slamming into flesh, the sound of objects breaking, Tina's pained cries for mercy. But David was too far gone to hear any of it. His world had narrowed to a single focus: release. The release of all the hurt, the anger, the confusion that had been building up inside him since the moment he had discovered the truth. But then, in an instant, it was over. Tina's body, once so tense and resistant, went limp beneath him. The fight drained from her, leaving her motionless on the floor. David's breath came in ragged gasps as he stared down at her, his hands still clenched into fists, his heart racing. The red haze of anger that had clouded his mind slowly began to lift, and with it came the cold, stark reality of what he had done. Tina wasn't moving. Blood pooled beneath her, dark and vivid against the floor, and David's heart lurched in his chest as the enormity of his actions began to sink in. The violence, the anger, it had all led to this moment. A moment from which there was no return. He stepped back, his body trembling, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The apartment, once filled with the sound of their struggle, was now eerily silent. David stood frozen, staring down at Tina's lifeless form, his breath catching in his throat as the weight of his actions settled over him, like a suffocating blanket. In that moment, the reality of what he had done hit him with full force. He had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. The woman he had once loved, the woman he had built a life with, now lay broken before him. And no matter how much he wished he could undo it, the truth was painfully clear. There was no going back. David stood in the middle of the apartment, his chest rising and falling with shallow, panicked breaths. The room, once familiar and comforting, now felt foreign, like a crime scene in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. His gaze remained fixed on Tina's lifeless body sprawled on the floor, the crimson stain spreading beneath her like a pool of his guilt. The reality of what he had done settled over him, suffocating and cold. His mind raced, desperate for a solution, for a way to undo the irreversible. But there was no undoing this. She was gone, and all that remained was the chilling silence that hung between him and the consequences of his actions. Fear tightened around his chest, constricting his every thought. He couldn't stay here. The police would come. The neighbors might have heard the struggle. Someone would soon knock on the door, wondering what had happened. His heart hammered in his chest as he scrambled to think, the walls of the apartment closing in on him with each passing second. Without fully thinking, David sprang into action. His movements were erratic, frantic. He rushed to the kitchen, grabbing a dish towel and wiping down the surfaces everything he had touched, everything that could hold his fingerprints. His hands shook as he swept the broken glass from the floor, the sharp edges cutting into his palms, but he didn't feel the pain. All he felt was the blinding need to erase his presence, to remove any trace of the violence that had unfolded here. He turned to Tina's body, dread pooling in his stomach. He couldn't leave her like this. But the thought of touching her again made his skin crawl with horror. Still, he forced himself to move. He grabbed her by the arms, dragging her toward the couch, trying to make it look as though she had fallen there. The blood followed, smearing across the floor like a haunting reminder of what he had done. His mind whirled with desperate thoughts. He needed to make it look like an accident, or maybe a break-in. Yes, a break-in. He rushed to the front door, pulling it ajar to make it seem as though someone had forced their way inside. He knocked over a few chairs, overturned a table, and swept random objects onto the floor, trying to create chaos, trying to manufacture a believable story. But no matter what he did, the truth loomed over him, heavy and inescapable. David's chest tightened as he glanced around the room. It wasn't enough. He wasn't thinking clearly. Panic clouded his judgment, but he knew one thing: he had to get out. He had to leave before someone saw him, before someone realized what had happened. Grabbing his jacket, he shoved his phone into his pocket and slipped out the door, casting one last glance at the scene of his crime. The apartment was silent, the chaos of his desperation lying in stark contrast to the stillness of Tina's body. David hurried into the night, his heart pounding, his thoughts a mess of fear and guilt, knowing that the lie he had crafted was as fragile as the life he had just destroyed. The hours after David fled the apartment were a blur. His mind raced as he stumbled through the streets of Lagos, the sounds of the city dull against the deafening thud of his heartbeat. His thoughts tumbled chaotically: panic, guilt, regret, all swirling in a whirlwind of fear. He couldn't outrun what he had done, but in that moment, the only instinct he had was to escape. He didn't know where he was going. His feet moved on their own, taking him farther and farther away from the scene of the crime. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of his actions was pulling him down into the earth. His breathing was shallow, his skin clammy with sweat. The world around him blurred into an indistinct haze: people, cars, streetlights, all of it meaningless as his mind grappled with the irreversible reality of what he had done. David's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him momentarily out of his daze. His hands trembled as he fumbled to check the screen. Missed calls, messages, from friends, from coworkers, and then a message from the landlord, asking about a disturbance reported by the neighbors. His heart sank, dread flooding his chest as he realized the facade he had tried to create was already beginning to crumble. In his panic, he had forgotten the smallest details, things that now felt enormous. The blood, his fingerprints, the mess in the apartment that wasn't convincing enough to hide what had truly happened. His mind raced through all the mistakes he'd made, each one tightening the noose around his neck. He was sure of it now: he had left too many traces, too many signs that pointed directly to him. It was only a matter of time before the police found him. Days passed, and with each one, the weight of the inevitable became heavier. David couldn't sleep. He barely ate. The guilt gnawed at him, growing louder with every quiet moment he tried to steal. The image of Tina's broken body haunted him, playing over and over in his mind like a cruel loop he couldn't escape. There was no peace. There was no solace. Only the crushing certainty that he had destroyed everything, including himself. He tried to go about his days as normally as possible, showing up to work, engaging in small talk with those around him. But it was no use. The paranoia was eating him alive. Every time someone looked at him, he saw suspicion in their eyes. Every time a siren wailed in the distance, his heart seized with fear that it was coming for him. He couldn't outrun the truth. No matter how much he tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, the cracks in his composure grew wider with each passing hour. The investigation began quickly. The police questioned neighbors and soon they came for David. It was inevitable. He had been Tina's boyfriend. He had been in that apartment just hours before her death. Their relationship, once a source of solace, was now the very connection that would unravel everything. The officers asked their questions his alibi, his whereabouts on that fateful night, and though David tried to keep his answers steady, the weight of his lies began to crush him. As the days wore on, David's paranoia reached a fever pitch. He started avoiding people, withdrawing into himself, convinced that every glance, every whispered conversation, was about him. He couldn't keep up the act. His guilt was too overwhelming, seeping into every part of his life until he was drowning in it. And then, one night, it all came crashing down. The knock on the door wasn't a surprise. David had been waiting for it, dreading it, but knowing deep down that it would come. When he opened the door, the officers stood there, their expressions grim, their presence heavy with the weight of what they had uncovered. They didn't need to say much. David's eyes told them everything they needed to know. He didn't fight. He didn't protest. The game was over. As they led him away in handcuffs, the reality of what he had done settled over him with finality. There was no escaping the consequences. The life he had tried to build, the future he had once imagined, was gone. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And now all that remained was the long, painful road of justice that stretched out before him. David's steps were heavy as they took him away, each one a step deeper into the consequences he had been running from.